The new two deep is out. Pat Narduzzi had a whole lot to say at his weekly press conference on Monday. And what's the latest on Pitt's quarterbacks? We got a lot to talk about here on the Morning Pitt Tuesday, September 13th, 2022 edition, moving into the week after the first loss of the season, heading into the week before the first road game of the season. There's a lot to talk about with this Pitt football team as they sit at 1-1, fresh off a loss to Tennessee over the weekend at Acrisure Stadium, and they will follow that with a trip to Kalamazoo to take on Western Michigan this Saturday. We'll have a lot to talk about with that game, certainly over the course of the week. But as we sit here on Tuesday, and I think it'll be our regular Tuesday thing here on the Morning Pitt on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, we're going to review some of what came out of Monday. Monday is sort of the first news day of the week. New two deep gets released. Pat Narduzzi holds his weekly press conference. They announce the ACC Players of the Week, new rankings to discuss. Well, the new rankings come out on Sunday, so we might talk about those on Mondays. We talked about it yesterday a little bit, with Pitt dropping in both major polls, but not dropping out of either poll. But we'll have a lot of stuff always to talk about here on Tuesdays, and I think it'll always start with the depth chart. The depth chart gets released as part of the weekly game notes. And it's always something to look forward to, even if we've found many times over the years and even this season so far that it doesn't always have a connection to reality. It doesn't always have a connection to what you'll actually see on the field. And there was a time where it often, the depth chart, rather than being a projection of what to expect in the coming week, was more a reflection of what you saw in the previous week. And that hasn't even been the case this year, although it kind of was. It kind of was last week. So they had their first two deep of the season before the West Virginia game, and at running back they listed Izzy Abanikanda and then Rodney Hammond. No ors there, just Israel Abanikanda, Rodney Hammond, and then Vincent Davis or Sibo Flemister. Hammond was the better back that day. Hammond put up better yards that day. Hammond also got hurt that day, but he had the better game. And so their two deep the following Monday had Israel Abanikanda or Rodney Hammond. And that made sense. That reflected what we saw in the game, where effectively they were co-starters. Izzy Abanikanda had the first quarter, Hammond had the second, Abanikanda had the third, and then Hammond eventually took over. But it seemed like the plan was to alternate quarter by quarter. And so the depth chart, putting an or between Abanikanda and Hammond, made sense. That reflected what we had seen in the most recent game. Never mind the fact that Hammond got hurt, and most everyone knew that he wasn't going to play against Tennessee, which made the or kind of a moot point, and even listing him on the depth chart kind of a moot point and sort of irrelevant because he wasn't going to play. Now we're coming out of the Tennessee game where Rodney Hammond did not play, wasn't even on the sidelines. I think he was up in the press box watching from, or on that level, watching from up there, because I think he has limited mobility and it's, dangerous to be on a sideline in that kind of situation. But even after that, Rodney Hammond still listed as an or starter with Israel Abanikanda. As a matter of fact, there were only two changes to this week's depth chart from the week 2 depth chart. After there was only one change from the week 1 to week 2 depth charts, there were two changes, week 2 to week 3. There was a change on offense. And at right tackle, you have Matt Gonsalves or Gabe Hoy as the starters. Now this was a change because for the first 2 weeks, Pitt listed Gabe Hoy as the starting right tackle with Matt Gonsalves behind him and then Jason Collier behind him. Of course, that was curious since Gabe Hoy didn't play in either of the first 2 games. He didn't play against West Virginia. He didn't play against Tennessee after being limited in spring camp and training camp following an injury in the Peach Bowl. Gabe Hoy warmed up each of the first 2 games. He was in uniform, going through the warm-up drills with the rest of the offensive line before the West Virginia game and before Saturday's game against Tennessee. But by the time the game kicked off, he was in sweatpants on the sideline and did not play. Gonsalves played almost the whole game, some snaps going to Branson Taylor. We'll talk about that in a second. Now this week, they decide to finally adjust the depth chart and go Gonsalves or Gabe Hoy as the starter at right tackle. My assumption is that Gonsalves will continue to be the starter and play the bulk of the snaps. I think Gabe Hoy would at least have a game in full uniform, not sweatpants, before he's really ready to go out there. Maybe as soon as he's cleared and ready to go, he steps right back into the starting lineup. I'm not sure, but obviously we all know there need to be some fixes found on the offensive line, and we're going to talk about this in a second when I get into Pat Narduzzi's comments from his press conference yesterday. We know there need to be some fixes on the offensive line. Right tackle is a position that needs to upgrade its performance and its level of play. I'm not sure if Gabe Hoy is the answer or not. I think Hoy did play well last year at right tackle. Is he going to solve that situation, particularly when he's stepping in somewhat cold after really not having a ton of practice reps, basically since the Peach Bowl? That's a question that we'll have to watch, and it'll be interesting to see if Hoy even makes the trip to Kalamazoo. Maybe by that point, maybe the third week of the season, he'll be ready to at least suit up and give it a try, in which case they would take him along, but it wouldn't be a total shock if he doesn't even travel. I think he's getting closer. I think he will play this season. Whether or not he'll be ready for week 3 remains to be seen. We'll talk about the offensive line in a second because Pat Narduzzi had some comments about that group after I asked him about him on yesterday during his press conference. On defense, there was one change on the 2 deep. Deslin Alexandra or John Morgan as the starters at defensive end. Haba Baldonado is obviously the starter at the other spot. The coaches went with Alexandra or Morgan this time. Previously, they just had Alexandra listed as the starter and Morgan as the backup. This change sort of reflects what we saw last week, which was that Deslin Alexandra did not play. He was hurt and left the West Virginia game late in the fourth quarter. Came out and warmed up before the game against Tennessee and then did not play. I'm not even sure if he was in uniform for the game, but he didn't get on the field and he didn't play. And so the defensive end rotation turned to Haba Baldonado and John Morgan, backed up by Dayon Hayes and Nate Temple. Although if you saw, Bam Brima actually started getting a lot of snaps. He took a penalty, a hands to the face or something, I think it was, that cost Pitt some yardage, obviously. But overall, he did get in and really probably got the most snaps of his career. I'll have to go back and look at those numbers, but he played quite a bit. So they ended up with 5 DNs that they were able to use. Deslin Alexandra wasn't one of them. Now they have Alexandra and Morgan listed as or co-starters. We'll see who's actually available and ready to go. We'll see if Alexandra can be back this week and ready to play. Those were the only changes to the depth chart, though. So again, we know not to put too much stock in this. I mean, they still list Solomon DeShields as the backup star linebacker behind Bengali Kamara. They list Tyler Wiltz as the backup money linebacker behind Shane Simon. When in reality, Wiltz has been built backing up Kamara at the star, and DeShields has been built backing up Simon at the money. Speaking of linebackers, I think it was big for Pitt to get Brandon George back. Solomon DeShields or Servassier Dennis couldn't play every snap again. I guess he missed one snap in the West Virginia game. He's a great player. He's a young college athlete. He should be. He should have the stamina and all that. But with Tennessee's tempo and just the sheer wear and tear of a beating of a full season, he wasn't going to be able to play every snap. But Brandon George was hurt and couldn't play against West Virginia. Getting him back and allowing him to give Servassier Dennis a break, I think was big. And he ended up making a big sack. So contributed in that way. But they're going to, they need that depth to continue filling out. And they use all 6 guys. They use Kamara, DeShields, Dennis, George, Simon, and Wiltz. Felt like there might have been, that was it. They used those 6 linebackers, and they rotated a decent amount, not a ton, but a decent amount, and got different guys out there to try to stay fresh. They're going to need that depth to keep filling out. And we talk about the defensive line needing to step up its play, maybe not living up to the expectations and the hype thus far. The linebackers as well. And there are some growing pains there. They're young players. They're inexperienced players. I mean, Shane Simon is a redshirt senior, but this is his first year starting and playing in Pitt's defense. Bengali Kamara is a junior. He played a decent amount late in the season last year. These are still, in these 2 games, he's played more snaps than he's ever seen in his college career. Solomon DeShields is the same way. Tyler Wiltz just transferred in from Missouri State, so he's stepping up a level in play. These guys, other than Dennis and George, really don't have a lot of game experience, don't have a lot of reps, and so there's going to be a learning process. There's going to be growing pains there. But now we're into week 3, and those growing pains need to decrease. That learning curve needs to level out, and those guys need to step up their level of play. They need to be better. But back to the depth chart, that's all that really stood out there. No oars at the field goal team after Ben Sauls went 2 of 4 in a game that went to overtime. Obviously could have had a big impact there. I didn't expect they would do anything with the depth chart at the place kicker position, but that's another spot that you would keep an eye on. Otherwise, the depth chart largely looks the same. And that includes the quarterback position, where Keaton Slovis is listed as the starter, Nick Patty is the backup, Nate Yarnell is the third. And I'm going to start with that last point, Nate Yarnell being the third, as we sort of segue into Pat Narduzzi's press conference yesterday. A lot of questions about a lot of topics. The offensive line was certainly one that I asked about, and we'll get into that in a moment. But I also asked Pat Narduzzi, who was the number 3 quarterback on Saturday? In training camp, he said that competition was unsettled. They weren't sure who their number 3 quarterback was. And, so who was it? Who was your third guy on Saturday? Who would have gone into the game? Narduzzi said, quote, I would say it's still unsettled. I would say it's unsettled. Kyler's been good. Nate Yarnell has been good. And then he went on to say a bunch of different things. And eventually says, I would say it's a toss-up who the third guy would be. Narduzzi seemed to say that Nate Yarnell has been working on the scout team. He said Nate Yarnell gives probably 2 out of 3 team periods. Nate's given us a look, which I think is what he means is that he's running the scout team for the defense, or running the offensive scout team to give the defense a look of what to expect out of the opponent. I don't know, even though Yarnell is listed as the number 3 quarterback on the depth chart, I think Derek Kyler might be the guy. I didn't notice this. A few people pointed out that Derek Kyler was warming up on the sideline when Nick Patty seemed to be a little hobbled in the second half of that game against Tennessee. So Derek Kyler maybe was the next one to go in. But this seems like it'll probably be relevant with Keaton Slovis leaving the Tennessee game at halftime, and then Nick Patty obviously being hurt and playing hurt. And, you admire the courage and the effort there. As far as the injury situation, there was nothing that was said at this press conference. There was nothing that was expected to say. It was maybe the second or third question Narduzzi got. What's the status of your quarterback room at the moment? Quote, like I always say, guys, I'm not talking personnel. On Monday, we all know what we know. I know nothing. How about that? And I think there's some truth to that. As it's become kind of clear that, Keaton Slovis is not necessarily dealing with a collarbone injury, which is what was sort of initially rumored, and maybe dealing with something that has to be monitored over the course of a week. Pat Narduzzi genuinely may not know who's going to be available for him and who's going to be, available to play on Saturday. And so maybe there's some truth there. I think even if Narduzzi absolutely knew, he probably wouldn't say anything either way. I think he would keep that to himself, and we'll talk to Pat Narduzzi again on Thursday, and I don't expect him to give up any information at that point either. I don't know what to expect. It would seem, from the rumors and from everything we sort of are hearing, that Keaton Slovis maybe is closer to coming back than Nick Patty. Nick Patty might need to be out for some time, although he obviously finished that game. And then you get into the third quarterback competition. I mean, there's a non-zero chance that the starting quarterback at Western Michigan is Derek Kyler or Nate Yarnell. I mean, I wouldn't say it's a likelihood or a probability or that's what I'm expecting, but I would say it's a non-zero chance that neither Keaton Slovis nor Nick Patty is available to go. Those guys got knocked around. They got beat up a lot. I gave this stat out that, according to Pro Football Focus, they were each pressured on 50% of their dropbacks. Each guy saw pressure on 50% of their dropbacks. For comparison, Kenny Pickett last season was pressured on less than 30% of his dropbacks, 27.7. All right, so when we talk about this offensive line and we talk about Kenny Pickett made them look better than they were and his mobility, covered a lot of the holes on the offensive line, I don't know that that's entirely the case. I don't know that that's necessarily accurate, because I think Kenny Pickett, if he, 70%, more than 70% of his dropbacks, he was not under pressure, that's not mobility, that's the offensive line holding up. Keaton Slovis and Nick Patty being under pressure 50% of the time, that has nothing to do with mobility. That's about the offensive line breaking down. And I asked Pat Narduzzi about that yesterday. It was the first question out of my mouth. Narduzzi gave his opening statement, and I said, what have you seen? What are the issues you've seen from the offensive line after 2 games? And Narduzzi says, quote, when you look at it, like, we got better. And then he goes on to sort of specific examples that are semi-related, that he's trying to illustrate his point, but he never actually makes the point. He just gives the examples. This is kind of a common Narduzzi rhetorical tool. We've all learned over the last 7+ years to appreciate and understand the Narduzzi rhetorical tools. And there were some interesting things in what he proceeded to say. But right now, I feel like this coaching staff is trying to preserve the confidence of the offensive line. I feel like this coaching staff is trying to improve the play of the offensive line. I don't think this coaching staff is at all comfortable with the way the offensive line has played. I don't think it's all on the offensive line. I think there are missed checks and missed calls, and the quarterback needs to change the protections and things like that. And Pat Narduzzi talked about that. He said the play right before the end of the first half, where Kedon Slovis was sacked, fumbled, and ended up leading to a Tennessee field goal, and Kedon Slovis being out of the game for the entire second half and overtime. He said that in that situation, they should have had the tailback staying in to protect, and the quarterback didn't make that check. He didn't make that call, and so some of it's on the quarterbacks, and that's always going to be the case. Sacks are never just about the offensive line. Sacks are about the O-line. They're about the quarterback, and they're about the running backs, and they're about the wide receivers. Guys don't run the right routes. Guys don't pick up the right blitzes. Guys don't make the right checks and calls to set the protection where it's supposed to be. There's 11 guys on the field, and on each side of the ball, and it truly does. Most plays are determined by more than just one guy or even just one position group. They're all contributing to it. And so I agree with Narduzzi in that regard. And I think there are probably a lot of examples he could point to where the quarterbacks were under pressure, or the quarterbacks got sacked, or the quarterbacks got hurt, and the quarterbacks share some of the blame in those plays. I'm sure he can find a lot of examples like that. But I can also find a lot of examples where the O-line just got straight up beat. And a lot of times, if you watch what Tennessee was playing, they had 6 guys in the box, and they weren't rushing all 6 every play. For them to make as many stops against the run as they did with 6 men in the box, for them to get after the quarterback as much as they did without all that much blitzing, because they really didn't bring more than 4 all that much. I mean, they blitzed, but it's not like they were blitzing on 60% of the snaps or even 60% of the dropbacks. And yet they still were able to get home and pressure Slovis and pressure Patty 50% of the time. There's a major issue on this offensive line. It's a disappointment. It's a disappointment so far. With the age and the experience that those guys have, as good as they were supposed to be, they are not living up to it. And like I said, it's a disappointment. And I have to think that there are people in the South Side who feel the same way, even if they're not going to say it publicly. Now, maybe some of the linemen themselves will say, yeah, we're disappointed in how we played. I don't think the coaches will call them out quite that harshly, but I think that sentiment is probably shared throughout the South Side. And then, one other thing that I really thought was interesting that Pat Narduzzi talked about during his press conference yesterday was RPOs. And I think we tend to think of RPOs as this fancy, modern college football thing that, all these other teams are doing, and Pitt never gets on board with it. And why doesn't Pitt run RPOs? Well, listening to Narduzzi yesterday, it's pretty clear that RPOs are part of this offense. I think Izzy Abanikand's long run, that 76-yard touchdown run that he had, I think that was off an RPO. And, Narduzzi talked, in answering this question about the offensive line, he talked about how there were a lot of RPOs where the quarterback pulled the ball and tried to throw and ended up putting himself in trouble, either under pressure or scrambling or getting sacked or making a bad throw, when rewatching on film, the right read was to give to the running back. And not only was that the right read, but there was also an opportunity for that to be a big play. Kind of like that one that Abanikanda broke. And Narduzzi was saying this is a way of pointing out that the offensive line is opening holes on these plays. But the wrong read is being made and the wrong play is being executed. And I thought that was interesting. And I think that's something that Mark Whipple had some of that in the offense last year. It sounds like, and in the way Narduzzi referred to it, the way Narduzzi referenced RPOs, kind of the context of what he was saying, it kind of feels like he's saying that they're not the bulk of the game plan or the foundation of the game plan, but they are a significant part of it. And so we'll be watching for that this weekend. Obviously, if you have a change at quarterback or you're not going with your starting quarterback or one of your top 2 quarterbacks, then maybe those plays won't get called as often. But that's something to keep an eye out for this weekend is, watch and see how much they use those kinds of plays, how often they use those kinds of plays, and what they get out of those kinds of plays. And whether Izzy Abanikanda and maybe Vincent Davis get more handoffs out of those situations and what they produce and what they result in. All right, I thought for a final thing here on Tuesday, let's take a look around the Coastal Division, particularly the Coastal, but also then the two other ACC teams that Pitt has to face. Louisville will start there, bounce back from the loss to Syracuse by beating UCF 20-14. Not exactly a blowout, but Malik Cunningham ends up with throwing for 200 yards, rushing for 120 and a touchdown. Maybe he's starting to find a little bit of a rhythm there after not really looking very good against Syracuse at all. I still think that's a game where Pitt should be able to have some success against Cunningham, at least based on how he played against Syracuse. Miami, number 15, top-ranked team in the Coastal, beat Southern Miss 30-7. Nothing really to look at there except Henry Parrish. Remember him? We talked about him last week, former Pitt commit. He was in the recruiting class with Izzy Abanikanda, decommitted, and ended up going to Ole Miss. Now he's transferred to Miami. This is his first year with the Hurricanes, and he's got back-to-back 100-yard games to open the season for Miami. He's got like 217 yards against Southern Miss. He had a $109 and a touchdown. So Henry Parrish kind of getting a little bit going. One of the more productive running backs in the ACC so far this season, at least on a 2-game basis. Duke. Look out for Duke here. Duke beats Northwestern on the road 31-23, and the Blue Devils are now 2-0. They beat Temple and they beat Northwestern. Pretty interesting. Is Duke good? I'm not entirely sure that I'm ready to go that far. I would point out, they've impressed so far. They've had a great start to the season, no question. Last year, after opening with a loss to Charlotte, they won 3 in a row, including games against Kansas and Northwestern. Northwestern at home last year, but they beat Kansas and they beat Northwestern, so they had 2 Power 5 non-conference wins to get to 3-1 last season, and then they lost 8 in a row to finish 3-9. So I'm sort of in pencil writing down that Duke might be good in pencil, not putting it in pen yet. North Carolina continues its run through the Sun Belt on the road. This time they beat Georgia State 35-28. Derek May, 284 yards and 2 touchdowns for the Tar Heels. Another escape against the Sun Belt team on the road. They barely beat Appalachian State last week. Now they get away from Georgia State, get out of Georgia State by a touchdown. North Carolina's 3-0, but there are a lot of questions. Virginia beat up by Illinois on the road 24-3. Tommy DeVito, the Illinois quarterback, formerly of Syracuse, threw for 2 touchdowns. Virginia only getting 3 points. Not exactly an endorsement for the Cavaliers' offense this season. Brennan Armstrong, 13 of 32 for 180 and 2 interceptions. Not good, Virginia. All right, Syracuse, since Pitt will play Syracuse. Is Syracuse good? We said, is Duke good? Is Syracuse good? They beat up on UConn 48-14. I was saying last week that Syracuse was favored by like 23.5 points, and I couldn't imagine that. When was the last time Syracuse was favored by 23.5 on the road against an FBS opponent? Well, they covered. They covered pretty comfortably. Garrett Schrader threw for 3 touchdowns. Sean Tucker had a 100-yard game. Only gave up 2 touchdowns in this one. Syracuse, more tough defense. Schrader's playing well. Tucker's running well. We'll wait and see on Syracuse, but pretty good start to the season so far at 2-0. Georgia Tech beat Western Carolina 35-17. Not much to say about that. Don't know much about Georgia Tech, and we're waiting. They obviously were more competitive with Clemson than people thought they would be in week 1. Even though they ended up, kind of on the losing end of a blowout. But they were more competitive than people expected them to be. We'll see kind of what that turns into. They're 1-1 now, and we'll see what the season actually is for Georgia Tech. Sort of still has that feeling of Jeff Collins being a dead man walking. And then finally, Virginia Tech gets its first win of the season. They beat Boston College in an ACC game. They won that game at home. I said on the message board, somebody had to win. Virginia Tech and Boston College, both teams were 0-1. Somebody had to win. Grant Wells threw for 140 yards and a touchdown. And after he had, 3 interceptions last week against Old Dominion? Did he have 4? He had no interceptions this week. So he's bouncing back. Phil Dracovic, 15 of 28 for 135, a touchdown and a pick. Not what you want to see if you're Boston College. You're hoping for a much better start to things than that. So Virginia Tech 1-1. They're 1-0 in the ACC, though, with that win over Boston College. Look, so all of that, I say all of that, about the Coastal in particular, but the ACC overall. I say all of that as a way of pointing out, or making a point that I made on the message board yesterday, that, look, this is still a very winnable conference for a lot of teams, Pitt included. This is a very winnable Coastal Division for several teams, Pitt included. Okay? No matter what happened on Saturday, and obviously a big factor here is going to be whether or not or when Keaton Slovis is ready to go. But this is still very much a conference that's there for the taking. If Pitt just keeps doing what they're supposed to do, keeps improving, keeps getting better as the season progresses. Listen, we're going to keep doing the Morning Pitt as the season progresses. Monday through Friday, every morning, we release this video, just kind of get you up to speed on everything going on in Pitt sports, let you know anything you need to know about, give you the talking points for the day. And it's all right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. See that little, down in your right-hand corner, that little blue rectangle? It's a subscribe button. It's on the yellow.com thing. Click that. You subscribe to our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com, and then turn on notifications. You'll get an alert right there on your phone every time we release a new Morning Pitt, every morning. And when we go live for our live show on Wednesday nights at 8:30 p.m. right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com. When we go live after the games for a post-game show, you get an alert when we're going live if you turn on notifications. So like this video, hit the subscribe button, and then make your way over to Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com, to get all of our Pitt coverage. Analysis, interviews, videos, everything you can need. Slideshows. I mean, we have a ton of stuff there. Recruiting interviews. We have a lot of stuff at Panther-Lair.com. You go consume the content, and then you go on the message boards and talk about it. It's the best online community of Pitt fans that you're going to find. Panther-Lair.com, Pittsburgh.rivals.com. Thanks so much for tuning in for today's Morning Pitt here on Tuesday. We appreciate it. Stay tuned to Panther-Lair.com for a lot more content. Make sure you subscribe right here to youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com so you never miss any of our Pitt video content. Have a great rest of the day on Tuesday. We'll see you tomorrow morning for another Morning Pitt right here on youtube.com/Panther-Lair.com.